liberator, but you can't murder liberation. You can murder revolutionary, but you can't murder revolution. And you can murder a freedom fighter, but you can't murder freedom.
You're tapped in, so let's get right to it. What's happening in the Middle East is an escalation is taking place. However, we're not being notified or told what the real happenings are on the ground over there. We do know the escalation involves Kuwait. The escalation involves Yemen. The escalation involves Saudi Arabia. And we're pretty sure that before this escalation de-escalates, it's going to escalate even more. I got Colonel MacGregor. All right, I have a clip on him, and he's discussing what's really taking place. All right, he's letting us know from not just his perspective, but the information that he is receiving from his ties or connections with those involved in this war that's taking place in the Middle East between the United States, Israel, and Iran, as well as the war that has begun between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. All right, so MacGregor argues that a conventional air campaign won't defeat Tehran. All right, and everyone has said this up to this point. You dropping bombs, but Trump, Israel dropping bombs on Iran would not make them fold, would not make them get in, come to the bargaining table, negotiate, or recognize Israel as, or with give Israel the recognition right to exist. You know what I mean? That's not going to make Iran do any of that. You know, in fact, what we think here at TAP is that it will embolden them to at some point say, okay, let's make the bomb. Let's go ahead and make the bomb, you know? And that's what we think. That's what this is all leading to. All right. Now, again, that campaign will not defeat Tehran. All right. And that this could push Iran towards localized ground moves. Now, in that respect, to give a little more context, that means that they're now eyeing Kuwait. Specifically, not just eyeing it and you know, going in, you know, they're talking about taking Kuwait. They are literally talking about going into Iranians, the IRGC, the Iranian government, are going to go into Kuwait and take it. That would be a bold move. And not only that, it would be a strike of genius if they can pull that off. Okay, but in terms of MacGregor's assessment, you know what I mean, his reasoning is that the United States and Israel are working off of a World War II lens, assuming airstrikes alone collapses a government, when Iran's military capability remains roughly 70%. So that's a direct contradiction and contrast to what Trump just said last night at the correspondence dinner, that they were basically, you know, out of everything. Oh, they only have a few of these left and a little bit of that. MacGregor is assessing that, and I would tend to take, you know, MacGregor's what he says with a little more, you know, a little more grain of salt, you know. Well, excuse me, I would take his analysis of the situation a little more seriously than I would that of Trump. Let me put it to you like that. But anyway, MacGregor is saying that the IRGC's military capability still remains roughly 70% intact and relies on decentralized underground missile infrastructure plus real-time surveillance backed by China. All right. So in other words, China is giving them logistics. They're telling them where to strike in Kuwait, where to strike in Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, wherever they want. You know, China is giving them logistics. And I like to add that it's been alleged that Russia is providing them with long range missiles, those real powerful ones, you know. And then we have yet to see what Iran has in terms or in types and terms of missiles that they haven't shot yet. All right. So that's still on the table. We'll see about that, and I think soon enough. On Kuwait's vulnerability specifically, MacGregor says Kuwait has nothing significant and ground defenses. So in other words, they couldn't stop an invasion if they wanted to. All right. And that even US purchased equipment there may not even be operational. So this is why we see the bombardment of Kuwait. They have no defenses. They have no patriots, and not that patriots work, but they have no patriots, no THAADs, none of that. And this is why we see Iran is able to successfully strike American bases and or assets in Kuwait because there's no defense there. He knows that Iran is already hitting Kuwait's desalination plants, so they're knocking out the water supply right there. Kuwait is a desert, and they're knocking out the water supply. So yeah, they're hitting Kuwait's desalination plants infrastructure. Roughly 5 million people depend on, and warns that if Iran or Iraq-based forces push south, there might not be much there to meet them. Okay, now the question is, and I think the question was posed to Colonel MacGregor, whether or not the United States could actually stop an invasion of Kuwait, and his assessment is thus. One regional defense assessment argues a large-scale Iranian ground seizure of hardened U.S. installations is operationally improbable given Iran's lack of the amphibious logistics capability needed, and frames the invasion talk as more of a deterrence messaging tool than an imminent plan. Now, I don't know. I got to buck against that because what they do know and what is known, Iran does have, all kind of small boats that can, you can put 20, 30 people in and send them across the strait real quick. Not only that, but they do have logistics, and the logistics is provided by China. So that's not a hard one right there, That's not hard at all. Though it does note a real verified, May 2020 incident where Kuwaiti forces intercepted an IRGC linked team attempting to breach Bubayan Island. Okay, so they've already cased the joint, so to speak. They've already made an assessment. They've already sent over, a crew to see how far they get or whether or not they can get all the way in. So that's been documented. But also Wikipedia's tracking of the conflict shows that U.S. and Kuwait have already been fighting off Iranian drone and missile strikes since February, with Kuwait intercepting 97 ballistic missiles and 283 drones alongside the United States and Kuwaiti casualties. So there's a real capability being demonstrated defensively, just not in such a way or to a degree that anyone is confident that they'd be able to hold the line, Kuwait, if Iran decided to come on in and do what they want to do, Now, on the U.S. ground invasion, and I want to bring this up because, MacGregor, he will speak on this, and he's spoken on it before. In terms of the U.S. ground invasion, let's say of Iran, Pentagon planning has reportedly focused on raids and limited seizures rather than occupation. All right, the force being assembled notably lacks the heavy armor and deep logistics needed for a sustained ground campaign. Now, with Kurg Island, and that's Iran's main oil export terminal, and securing enriched uranium stockpiles as the two main objectives under consideration, none of which have been up to this point realized. We think that a few months back when the pilots were shot down in Iranian territory and they supposedly went to rescue them, that was, we think, an attempt to sneak into into the destroyed interest of those underground bunkers that houses the depleted or the uranium stores that they have there, the enriched uranium they have down there. We think that attempt that the United States was trying to make was thwarted by the Iranians, and this is why you saw all those aircraft being shot down in the span of hours. They were actually trying to make an entrance into one of those destroyed tunnel entrances, but were repelled against the IRGC and the citizens, I might add, and the citizens. So yeah, there that is. But the bottom line is whether the U.S. Kuwait could stop an Iranian ground force or push depends on entirely on scale. So intercepting missiles and drones is one thing, you know what I mean? But stopping a landing party, a force of who knows how many from landing on your coast, landing on your beaches, and repelling them is something totally different. You never know how that might turn out. You never know. And being that Kuwait doesn't have those types of weapons to repel an invasion, let's say on the scale that Iran or the IRGC may launch, hey man, they may fall fairly quickly. And then also, just so I want this to be noted, there is a report that America is removing military assets, namely, aircraft and as well personnel from Kuwait. So don't be surprised, people. I have a clip. Let's bring this clip in. Before I do, as always, please like, share, follow, comment, and subscribe to the Art of Political Discourse, because this is where you're tapped in for a lot of informative and educational, a lot of respects, information that we're not normally going to get, or you're not normally going to get on state-ran television and other, media outlets like that. So let's get to this clip so you guys can see what I've seen and get a grand understanding, or get an understanding of what's occurring as I have, all right? But maybe even better for yourselves, okay? All right, let's bring him in here. Okay, this is Douglas MacGregor, retired colonel.
Is that this is a race between, on the one side, our rapid financial crisis spinning out of control and our economy plummeting, and this so-called war with Iran.
Now, in terms of the economy, so in terms of the war, what has been spent in taxpayer dollars, we've already exceeded, I think, 200 billion. Over 200 billion. All right. And that's in taxpayer dollars to support and pay for the war. And then also the Pentagon and the Department of War head, Pete Hegseth, is asking for an additional 70 billion. Now put that on top of the 1.5 trillion that they came into the year, requesting. In fact, maybe a trillion of it they already had from last year. But an additional 500 trillion was added to that. And then another was being requested of 500 billion, was being asked to ask for the Pentagon in terms of, restocking weapons and things of that nature. So this is a big ticket. This is a big ticket with no results, and as long as Donald Trump and his administration and Benjamin Netanyahu and the Zionist regime in Israel can keep saying, hey, Iran would not have a nuclear weapon, they'll continue to get the money, because they're spreading fear that Iran is actually trying to build a nuclear weapon. And by all accounts, especially in the intelligence community all over the world, including the intelligence community here in the United States, said that's not so. So what are they spending these dollars for war for? There's no bomb being built, no nuclear weapon being built by Iran. Never was.
Of air and missile power. And the question is, which one gives way first? And I think the air and missile power war could conceivably outlast the financial crisis. But the point is, once you hit the financial crisis, everything stops. So what we're seeing right now from Iran is a very methodical approach to targeting. And they're targeting the things they said they would. And they're going after the statelets. Great thing. And note that Kuwait in particular has been a very, very popular target for Iran. And I predict when this war ends, whenever it does, that Kuwait will cease to exist. It'll simply become part of Iraq. Which is kind of interesting, given that we fought a war to prevent that, did we not?
1990, 1991 war with Iraq, and it supposedly started over Iraq wanting to overtake Kuwait and its oil. That was the narrative. That was what was told to the people. And so the United States went in and had the first Iraq war. That was back again, I think, in 1990, maybe even 91. But yeah, it was to protect Iraq, Kuwait. Kuwait can't stand alone or by itself because already its neighbor Iraq thinks it belongs to them. So one way or another, it's going to fall.
I was thinking that very thing, actually. Yes.
And then
how ironic it was.
Stateless, you see the same thing. They're going after those things, but we also have the shaping operation, which is to prepare Israel for attack. Their assumption is that they'll have to go back and attack Israel because Israel's not going to sit there quietly. At some point, there will be another resumption of operations there. And I think it's very clear the Iranians want to systematically remove all the radars and all the anti-missile missile batteries and so forth. And the same thing is true up and down the coast, from across from Karg Island all the way down to Chabahar. So that, you know, the opportunity, unfortunately, for some kind of land operation seems very real.
Well, as a matter of fact, I mean, that is starting to become more and more spoken. We had Professor Morandi on yesterday, who did not hesitate to say he thought that maybe not Iran per se, but the resistance fighters in Iraq could move on Kuwait. He said that openly. The Houthis in Saudi Arabia, in the southwestern corner of Saudi Arabia, could move in. And then here, this just in the last, I guess this was just last night, the resistance affairs experts, the rulers of Arab countries should know that Iran has no fear of conducting ground operations against them. I was looking this morning at some of the targets that have been hit overnight, and I've noticed a lot more are being hit on border control points in Kuwait, which makes it look more and more like something's coming. The fact that they're talking about this openly on Iranian television, that seems to imply that there is serious possibility to that. Now, that would seem just out of the ordinary. Iran is just trying to hunker down and survive, but now there's...
No, it looks as if Iran is softening targets because they very well may be getting ready to go in and take Kuwait. And again, and that could be on the front end. That could be just what they want the United States and Israel to see or think, while again using the back end of the Iraqi resistance forces to go on in and start that process. So, you know, you got a two-prong or two-point invasion that could possibly take place, and that for all intents and purposes, Kuwait will not be able to handle at all, you know. And again, the United States, they'd be caught in that would be, you know, technically a quagmire. You got someone attacking from the back as well as the front, you know, of Kuwait. You know, the reports again that come in my timeline, in my feed, is that the United States is evacuating military assets, and namely jets and all kinds of aircraft, as well as military personnel. They're moving them out of Kuwait. So this could very well be taking place as we speak.
Actually talk that they may go on a ground offensive. Do they have that capability?
Yes, they have the capability to overwhelm not just Kuwait, but they could go after the other Emirates. Remember, the only thing that really stood between the various statelets in the Gulf and Iran for years was American military power.
United States.
We essentially picked up the British mission. The British mission, after they created these little statelets, was to ensure that the oil states would be protected so that the oil would flow freely down to the...
Okay, and so keep in mind, he just mentioned, you know, the real culprits in all this stuff that's happening in the Middle East was the UK, the British. They're the ones who initially agreed with Lord Rothschild to allow Ashkenazi Europeans to come into Palestine. They, you know, decided that they would put Ashkenazi Europeans in Palestine, not even consulting the Palestinians as to whether or not this is what they do. Now, the British took this stance or had this attitude because they had already been in there, and it was sort of a colonized land. British had already been over there with their forces and, you know, doing Lord knows what. you know, so they had already had position there. And they decided, okay, look, y'all come on over here, especially after World War II, and we're going to establish an Israeli state in the land of Palestine. This is what Britain done. And you had, of course, other the United Nations was formed after World War II. And of course, the League of Nations and others had joined in with Britain, said, yeah, let's send them over there. So all this stuff really started because the UK, Britain, had involved itself, interfered with, geopolitical issues, or interfere with other countries, other sovereignties in terms of how they lived their lives and who was allowed on their land and things of that nature. Now we see, or we've heard, that not only is it Israel that they helped get established over there on Palestine, but they also helped to form Kuwait, UAE, Bahrain, all these countries in the Middle East. They did this as a means to stop Iran. They did it as a means also to, maybe if it push came to shove, to combat Saudi Arabia. But more than anything else, they did it for the resources that are on those lands and in that region. That's how it has to be viewed. This was all conducted and done, especially after 1946, 47, to secure resources as much as anything else over there.
Persian Gulf up through the Suez and then off to Europe and Great Britain. So that makes perfect sense. And the Arabs have demonstrated perfect sense, and Europe and Great Britain would flow freely. Oil states would be protected after they created these little after they created these little states.
I had to do that so that you guys can catch what he said, because I had just said this. And just so you know, in all seriousness and honesty, I hadn't looked at this whole piece, especially up to this point. So I didn't have any idea he would say almost verbatim what I've said.
Was to ensure that the oil states would be protected so that the oil would flow freely down through the Persian Gulf, up through the Suez, and then off to Europe and Great Britain. So that makes perfect sense. And the Arabs have demonstrated pretty conclusively, I'm talking about the people in the Arabian Peninsula and certainly in the Gulf, that they're not really capable of protecting themselves, or they're not willing to. And now
they're a bunch of Nancy girls, you know what I mean? They, in robes and turbans, and they sit up and sip tea and and wear big swords and daggers, but they're not a fighting people, and this is why they allow the United States and other European nations to come on their land, in their territory, and set up bases to protect them. They actually, United States is just a paid for military force to protect them against others who would, without the United States being there, will come in and take all that stuff. Because in a lot of respects, a lot of them have no right to the land. These are also other people similar to those Zionist Ashkenazis over in Israel or Palestine. They're similar. There are a lot of ties. There's a lot going on that we don't know about, that's not necessarily out there in terms of information to give us a grander understanding of what's really in play here. But those countries that he's talking about, that I'm talking about, those are also people who really don't have any rights to the land.
We have this public discussion of a potential arrangement with Saudi Arabia to provide nuclear materials. I mean, this is just astonishing. It's almost as though we're not satisfied to come to some sort of arrangement with Iran. We want to blow the entire region of it.
Yeah.
And obviously we turned to the Kurds in the hopes of mobilizing them. And I think the Iranians have skillfully eliminated any platforms or bases in Iraq or Syria from which the Kurds could launch against Iran. And I know that the Turks have been helpful to the Iranians in that regard. They've helped them target the Kurds. Both the Turks and the Iranians share the same interest, suppressing the Kurds, preventing them from helping to tear the region apart.
Yeah, in fact, there's been a lot of bombing up in this quadrant here of late on the near Erbil, and where a lot of the Kurdish areas are here, and also inside this territory as far, I think, even into Syria, but because Iran has been going after those. And I just wanted to go after you here. This is the territory of Kuwait right here, and at least what Professor Morandi.
Okay, so let's go on and get out of there. Professor Morandi is an Iranian who's in social media quite a bit and the news. Some news outlets here in the United States, he makes showing, via Zoom or whatever. And he talks about basically his support for the Iranian government and, its sovereignty. Morandi, we actually did a piece on him last week here at TAP. And his thing is, it's all wrong. The attack was wrong. It was unjustified. Israel's place in the region is wrong. They aren't justified to be there. The United States presence in the region is unjustified. They have no reason to be there. And in fact, Morandi is saying that because these two factions, the Ashkenazi Zionist regime of Israel and the United States military presence, is the problem for most of what is taking place and has been taking place in the Middle East for some 50, 60, almost 70 years. So this guy Morandi, oh man, American politicians and military people can't stand him. They call him a puppet, but that would be no different than, Hegseth, Marco Rubio, or any others who do the bidding of the Trump administration. So, hey, what difference does that make? But what we do understand in terms of this region is that it will implode upon itself, because that's the only way. Actually, we think that the United States and Israel can get, to some degree, Iran to bow a knee or fall to his knees. The only way to get Iran is through, and we think this is very much possible, the other countries in the region. If they can get them all together to, do their fighting for them, proxy wars, then they will. But we're dealing with countries, again, that don't have the stomach for warfare, that pays for military protection from the United States. And in a lot of respects, Israel also has bases or can land and bring equipment in some of these Arab nations. All right. Now, the latest talk that I've heard, and it's been bantied about, and this is recent, is that Saudi Arabia is asking for a nuclear program, and they're promising that this nuclear program will only benefit the people. It won't be for weapons. Wink, wink. Okay. There it is. So the United States is supposedly agreeing to send their nuclear specialists over to begin laying out plans for nuclear facilities. Now, I don't think that's going to fly well. I don't think that's going to fly well. And in fact, once this was discovered, Saudi Arabia then said, and if Iran makes a nuclear weapon, we're going to make a nuclear weapon. Yeah, this thing's going to be all shot to hell. So, there that is in a nutshell. I don't know. I tend to think that a lot of what we see taking place is being done. The war is they're rethinking it from the United States perspective and from Israel's perspective. They're not going gung-ho like they started back in February. They see they're not getting anything done. So those, those who think, a little more clearly than Trump and Netanyahu have prevailed in that respect. So we think they're in the, in the back room on the drawing board again. Okay, so how can we do this? How can we get rid of, how can we accomplish our end? How can we get this done? And they're realizing, man, we're going to have them fighting one another. We'll have them fighting one another, until such a time where we think Iran is weakened as a result of these fights between Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Jordan, Oman, UAE, Bahrain, all these countries. When they think they've really depleted their weapon stock, that's when I think that they'll come back in and then try to, their coup de grace, cut them off at the knees, knock them all the way down. But until then, it's a work in progress. I think the United States is trying to prepare those Arab nations to do the war for them. Because if you listen and pay attention Trump is always saying we're there helping them. It's not our war, you know, we don't need nothing. We're helping them. So I think this is going to be the game plan now, that they'll use those Arab nations as proxies to wage war against Iran. That's what they're working on. I'm pretty sure of it. Now, I think that that might not fall through. That might be a lost cause because, again, you have Yemen, you have Iraq. You may even have, to some degree, Syrian forces or Syrians who may be, you know, looking at this thing differently in terms of, okay, you know, they're looking at what the United States has done to them. They're looking at what Israel has done to them. And they may be coming to the realization that, you know what, we have to be in this and we have a common enemy. The United States and Israel are our enemy. And so let's start making plans behind closed doors in terms of supporting Iran and or Iraq if it comes to this. And again, we already heard that Turkey helps Iran in its own way by getting rid of the Kurds. You know, and, you know, if you keep in mind also, United States and Israel tried using the Kurds, the CIA and Mossad. They went and sent all this money over there and these guns, and Iran intercepted all that. Took their guns and their money, you know. And in fact, some of the guns did get to some of the Kurds, but guess what? The Kurds took the guns and ran. You know, so yeah, we'll see how this plays out. Let us know what you think about this. Will there be a ground invasion of Kuwait? And would that invasion come from both ends of one? Is Iran willing and ready to invade Kuwait? And if so, for what reason? What's the objective behind that? You know what I mean? How strategically sound is an invasion, a takeover of Kuwait? And whether or not the Yemenis or the Houthis can come in from the back end and also lay or apply pressure to Kuwait. And if that's the case, if pressure is applied, will Kuwait crumble? Will it fall? Let us know what you think in the comments, all right? Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.
You can murder a liberator, but you can't murder liberation. You can murder a revolutionary, but you can't murder revolution. And you can murder a freedom fighter, but you can't murder freedom.